Thanks for joining me. Today we're talking about bump and go cars.
Have you ever seen one of those little bump and go cars? These cars are a combination of batteries, aluminum, teeny rubber tires, and a few small metal sprockets. But what makes the toy so intriguing is that it never gives up. It never stops running, even when it crashes into an object. And when it does, it's smart enough to turn around and choose another course. Sometimes, when we're in pursuit of a worthy goal, we find that we have to keep moving ahead even when we run into obstacles. Then, perseverance is a good thing. But sometimes we run into obstacles and crash into stuff because we've gotten off course. In cases like that, to keep banging our heads against the wall is a bad thing. Sometimes God uses the negative circumstances and these hard knocks in our lives to get our attention so that we can see our need to turn around. But the question is, when you're facing an obstacle, how do you know whether you should try harder or turn around? This is something that I've really struggled with, but I found that there's 3 questions you can ask that will help give you some clarification. Number 1 is what? What is it that you are doing? Are you obeying or are you being contrary to God's word? If it's something that's clearly against God's word, then easy answer, you're going against God's will and you're just banging your head against the wall. But if it's something that God calls us to do, something that is part of the Great Commission, then you may be on track. Question number 2, why? What is your motivation for doing this thing that you're trying to do? What is the driver behind it? Why do you want to do this thing? Or why does this thing need to be accomplished? And number 3 is who? Ask God, is this your will for me? Sometimes there may be another leader down the line that you need to invest in and prepare for this task or this challenge. Or there could be another person that you need to bring on board. We're not called to be lone rangers. We're to do things with one another, with our brothers and sisters.
Sometimes your struggles may be because you're outside of God's will and there's a punishment that is coming with that. But if you're doing what you believe to be right and you run into block walls and issues, don't automatically assume that is God telling you to stop, because you very well may be attacked by the enemy. Let's take a look at Paul. I mean, he took 3 missionary trips all around his known world at that time, and he wanted to go out to Asia and to Rome, and then he got stuck in Jerusalem and got caught up, and then ended up making it to Rome, but not as he planned. Our verse this week comes from 2 Corinthians. Of the Jews, 5 times received I 40 stripes, save 1. Thrice I was beaten with rods, once I was stoned, thrice I suffered shipwrecks. A night and a day I have been in the deep, in journeyings often, in perils of water, in perils of robbers, in perils by mine own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness, in painfulness, in watching often, in hunger and thirst, in fasting often, in cold and nakedness. This was written during Paul's 3rd missionary journey. So he'd already taken a couple other missionary journeys before this one. But even after he writes this, he has another shipwreck and goes through a crazy amount of legal stuff that takes him from Jerusalem all the way to Rome. So after Paul's 3 missionary journeys, where he talks about all of these beatings that he had, he's arrived to Jerusalem and a riot breaks out. So then Roman soldiers put him in protective custody, and a Roman commander ordered him to be beaten in order to get a confession. But Paul claims that he's a Roman citizenship, which he is, so by his Roman citizenship claim, that he escapes the whip. Paul was brought before a Jewish council, but because of his Roman citizenship, they weren't able to kill him. Paul was placed back into protective custody, but because there was a plot to kill Paul, then they transferred Paul to Caesarea. Well, Paul defended himself before the governor there. His name was Felix, and the new allegations were brought by the Jewish leaders, and they wanted him to be transferred back into Jerusalem. But Paul argued his case that he should be able to be brought before Caesar. So Agrippa and Festus heard Paul speak, and with a group consensus, they determined that he was guilty of nothing. So Paul left for Rome, courtesy of the Roman Empire. But on their way to Rome, while protected by Roman soldiers, a storm came up and their ship wrecked. And they were stranded out, and they were with locals. And while the locals were helping them, and they had built fire, and Paul went to gather firewood, he got bit by a poisonous snake. He did eventually make it to Rome, but it was just one thing after another between legal things and shipwrecks. I mean, this was one trip from him from Jerusalem to Rome, and he went through the ringer. But because those things were hard, does that mean that he was outside of the will of God? Like with many things, there's a balance between whether you go off the rails on one side or off the rails on the other. I mean, when things go wrong, it could mean that God is giving that protective barrier, saying like, hey, heads up, this is a bad thing. But it could be that we are supposed to obey in spite of those troubles. But sometimes we get in this rut of thinking like, if it's easy, then it must be God's will. But if it's hard, then there must be something up, and God doesn't want me to do this. Oftentimes, it's the complete opposite. God calls us to do the hard things. The hard things have not been done because they are hard. The easy things have been done already. And God may have you in this exact moment in time because He wants to call you to the hard things. Don't be afraid of the hard things. Go after the hard things. Don't run from gunfire. Run toward gunfire. Be the one who charges the line. But whatever you do, stop. Pray. Ask God, is this in your will? Don't just assume that because it's hard, that it's outside of God's will. Because that might be the very thing that He's called you to do. Talk to God about it. He's the one that's got all the answers. Thanks for joining me.